And we're recording.
We're now recording, okay. My name is David Peterson. I've been asked by the History Project to share some of my memories, slanted and corrupted as they may be, on the early days of gay community news. Today is Wednesday, August the 25th, which actually is the 42nd anniversary of my coming out. And we're here at my home on Magazine Street in Cambridge. That's in Massachusetts, USA, former colony of Great Britain. And I came to Boston in 1965. The public reason was I came here to go to MIT. The private reason was that I had found out while I was at Purdue that I was one of those people, and I was sent here to go into therapy to get cured. And we all know how well that worked. Anyway, I started getting involved with gay and lesbian things shortly after my coming out 42 years ago. I sought out what organizations there were. The first organization that I became involved with was the Homophile Union of Boston, known as HUB, H-U-B, and then I gradually became involved with some other organizations. But my primary one of my earliest involvements was with HUB doing public speaking, and I worked with Laura McMurray from Daughters of Bilitis, and we decided to coalesce the speaking portions of those two groups plus some others, and so in February of '72, Laura and Harry Phillips and I started the Gay Speakers Bureau, as it was known, that it's now still in existence, and known as Speak Out Boston. So that's just a little bit of background, and partly based on how well it had gone to sort of merge public speaking efforts of some of the organizations in town. I started noticing in the fall of '72 and early in '73 that pretty much every GLBT organization had their own newsletter, which announced little bits of news that they had heard, because there wasn't any news in the mainstream press at the time, and also events that they were holding, dances, meetings, rap sessions, whatever. And so there was a newsletter from Daughters of Bilitis, DOB, there was a newsletter from HUB, there was a newsletter from Homophile Community Health Service, I believe. Student Homophile League put out a newsletter. And these were ongoing, and I also noticed that occasionally an individual, primarily I would single out Charlie Shively, occasionally individuals would pull together a newsletter that would come out periodically, which could be once a month or whatever, and it came out as long as before they burned out, you know. And that had been going on for a couple of years, and I noticed that when those newsletters came out, and those were sent out to maybe a few hundred people, during the time that those newsletters came out, there was like a little, not quite a flurry, sort of a flurriette of additional activity. There would be new people gathering to get something going, or attendance at events would increase or whatever. And it occurred to me, if we took that energy, because the problem with the individual newsletters were nice. The problem was it was one person doing it totally on their own, at their own expense, and so people burned out pretty quickly. And it occurred to me that if we could combine the energies from the various organizations and from some of the individuals, that we could put out a community newsletter. And this would be just so efficient, and it would just cause us to grow so rapidly, and everybody would know everybody else's stuff. You know, the people from DOB would know what Homophile Community Health Service was doing and what SHL was doing, and it would just be great, especially for those of us involved in different organizations. It didn't occur to me that this might actually reach people whose only contact with our community was, at the bars or other gathering places. So anyway, so in the same way that I'd put together a proposal for Gay Speakers Bureau, I also wrote up a proposal for what I called a gay community newsletter. And I talked to the various people at various organizations, and I sort of did an estimate of how many were on different mailing lists, and what that would be combined, and how this would work, what kind of, how many people doing what would be required, and how much money it would require, and where that money would come from, and everything. And then I contacted all the people involved, and I called a meeting at the Charles Street Meeting House for early June of 1973. And I thought that this is, I'm really excited about this, and this is going to really, turn into something, and I'm tired from writing the proposal, so as soon as it starts, then I can retire and everybody will love the idea. Well, I'd forgotten that oftentimes trying to get activists, especially GLBT activists, together on one project on the same page is like trying to herd cats. And so, of course, well, what happened was people showed up at the meeting, and a lot of the key people that I had hoped would be there, who I'd discussed this idea with, weren't there for whatever reason. And I know there were some schedule conflicts. Somewhere I actually have the sheet of the list of people that I invited, and then there's another sheet that we handed around for people to sign up who were there. And a few things happened at that meeting. One was that there were a lot of people there, between 15 and 20 people. And I would say roughly half of them were people that I had never seen before. Because I had negotiated with Randy Gibson, who was the minister at the Charles Street Meeting House at the time. I negotiated with him to use some space in his building to have the meeting, and he had quite graciously taken it upon himself to invite people that he thought might be interested in the idea, because I discussed it with him. And he supported the idea, and so he brought in a lot of people who were involved with the Meeting House Cafe that was running at the time, that was also a gathering place for gay and lesbian people. And I knew a few of those people, but not very many of them. And so here was this room full of people, and I handed out my proposal, and people could look at the proposal. And then, out of that, there was actually a committee formed to put out a newsletter. Now, I have two different memories of that meeting, and one of them I discussed with you, Libby, before, which was that my gut level memory was that people had taken the proposal that I wrote and had looked at it and maybe used the back of it to make notes on or something, but hadn't really looked at it very carefully. And then a few days ago, I actually ran across a copy of the first issue of what was then known as the Gay Community Newsletter. It was volume 1, number 1, of what turned into GCN. And the end of the introduction, there's basically a summary in stating the purpose of the newsletter. There was basically a summary of what was in my proposal. And indeed, the rest of the content was basically focusing on events and so on, and a calendar of events and phone number contacts for various organizations, and announcements largely from existing organizations. So this sort of indicates that maybe it actually did start out very close to what I had in mind, because I never envisioned, nowhere in my proposal was there anything indicating that it might become a standalone publication that would have literary and major news content from the outside world. fortunately, other people came along and added that. So the thing is, I remember a feeling of things not having gone quite the way I had planned. Now that could be because I tend to micromanage and want to be I'm a control freak in some ways, especially back then. And so it may be that I was hung up on some little things, you know. But in any case, within a week, the first copy of the Gay Community newsletter rolled off the Minio, and published every week since then, through whenever it stopped in the 1993 or whatever, 89, whenever it stopped. And the only time we missed an issue was during the blizzard of 1978. The year in 81, 82, where our office was torched, and we lost everything. We published that week. The only time we didn't publish was during the blizzard, and that's a later chapter. But pretty much all of Boston was shut down at the time. Let's see, what else did I? Okay. I think it's important to describe somewhat the atmosphere of those early issues. Mechanically, the first several, and I don't know how many of the first several issues were done, they were printed out on some kind of a mimeograph type, a hand-operated thing. And two of the people who showed up at that initial meeting, people that I didn't know but soon came to know very well, were Ian Johnson and Tom Morganti. And I remember Tom was the chief turner of the mimeograph, and he had very sore arms because of that. It was just a lot of physical work doing that. And Ian was elected the first editor of the newsletter, and I'm not sure whether that happened, how early in the process that happened. I actually, after the initial meeting, I decided, okay, I've done my thing, I can go on to the next project now. And then I came back about 3 days later. And I think that was a combination of my wanting to control things, and also that I was rather excited about this, you know, because even though the introduction said this is not a we're not going to be a literary thing, and part of that was, I know, in my proposal, because there were some literary publications that were available at the time, and we didn't want to in any way try to, you know, threaten those or, you know, interfere with what they were doing. But anyway, I remember that when the time came to elect someone as editor, people went around the room, and, you know, everybody sort of like gave their credentials. Well, there was no one there who was solidly in the journalism profession. And Ian Johnson mentioned that he read the Boston Globe nearly every day. And so we figured, well, that's, you know, after assessing everybody's credentials, those were the highest editorial credentials, journalist credentials we had in the group. And so he was elected the editor, and he did a wonderful job. Ian is one of the people without whom Gay Community News would not have survived. And there are a number of people in that category. One of the things that impressed me a lot was that on the 10th anniversary of GCN in 1983, and then on the 30th, when we had a reunion in New York on 2003, each time we attempted to go back through the masthead and our own personal lists and list the people who had at least made it to masthead level, and then all the people who, for various reasons, didn't want to be listed in the masthead, or we just didn't get around to including them or whatever. And there are definitely hundreds, and I suspect even thousands of people who made their way through, who contributed in some major or minor way. It was all important to the existence of Gay Community News. But I did want to describe the atmosphere there in the meeting house, which we were at for several months. We were the room, if you visualize it's about, I would say, probably maybe a 15 by 20 or 25 foot room. And if I'm sitting at one end, and there was a double desk in there, and I would be sitting at the desk, and back of me, Charles Street, a wall, and then Charles Street running outside. And then over in this corner was a door which went up led to a stairway which went up to the sanctuary. And then there was a payphone on that wall, and then an old crummy couch that had been hauled in from somewhere, and then a doorway to the church kitchen. Every church has a kitchen. And then on the far wall was a doorway which went into sort of the rest of the basement, which was and I'm not quite sure where that door was, but it may have been out sort of in a little hallway. But I know there was a doorway fairly accessible to this room that went into the rest of the church, which is where Randy Gibson and several of his children lived. And also part of that space was kind of a church office, and that's where the mimeograph was. So you would see the stencils disappear into that room, then you would hear this ka-chunk, 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 and then sheets would come out, and we would let them dry and then collate and staple and everything. Anyway, so there was that, and then there was a doorway into the Meeting House Cafe, and there was also a little hallway directly out to the street. And then in back there was a window out to the street, to Charles Street. And because the ground floor of the meeting house was a foot or so below grade of the sidewalk, that window was pretty low in the building, and it was pretty easy for people just to drop in, through the window, which sometimes they did. So that's kind of the physical layout, and because of that layout, this was kind of a crossroads of just about everything that went on at the meeting house. You'd have people, there was an event upstairs in the sanctuary, whether it was a meeting or a dance or even a religious service. There would be people coming up and down the stairway to use the payphone or to go into using something in the, to go to the cafe, and it's interesting, I'm sure there was a bathroom in that, and I don't remember where it was. I'll get back to that in a moment. But anyway, and then there was the kitchen, and the kitchen had, along with huge refrigerators and storage and so on, it also had the sterilizing machine. So the people in the coffee house, they had their own place to set up, to plate little slices of, cheesecake or whatever, and pour out hot water for tea. But they needed, excuse me, they needed a place where they could sterilize their dishes. So all the time, and we were sort of almost there 24 hours a day, at Gay Community News. There would be a flow of people coming through with great trays of clanking dishes, going out to the kitchen, then carrying other trays of clanking dishes back the other way. People from the Meeting House Cafe who wanted to use the phone would come back, and they would set their plate of pie on whatever copy someone was editing, on the desk, and then use the phone. Sometimes spill coffee along the way or whatever. And of course we were trying to use the phone too. Now initially we used the meeting house's phone number, but within a few weeks that just became unfeasible, and we had a payphone installed. That's when the payphone became there, and that also then was used by the public that was using the coffee house. So there was a flow of people that direction, and then Randy's family, even if we were there in the middle of the night, some of them would come paddling out to get a snack out of the kitchen, and there were people from the meeting house who would just be wandering around the building and would drift into the kitchen or drift into our space and would, you know, be curious as to what was going on and everything. And we picked up a number of volunteers that way, actually. In fact, I remember John Kuiper telling me that he got involved with the newspaper around issue number 3, although I thought he was involved earlier. But he told me that he had gotten it, you know, involved around issue 3, and it was because he'd been in the coffee house, and he had wandered back to see what was going on, and and he of course became one of the most staunch supporters of gay community news, not only through writing but other work too. So in addition to the sort of the internal traffic, we had people walking down the street, you know, at the window, so there was a lot of street noise coming in, and also because there was this steamy sterilizer in the kitchen, and the kitchen wasn't really well ventilated, we were sort of like in the ventilation shaft for that, so we had the window open definitely during the summer and during a lot of the winter too, because there was so much heat, you know, coming from the kitchen. Also in addition, that, as I say, people did sometimes drop in through the window. There was one evening we were working there, and suddenly there was this man that appeared at the end of the room. He had obviously come in through the window, and he was wearing pajamas and seeming a bit disoriented, and someone noticed that he had a band on his wrist, the hospital ID, and he had wandered in from somewhere at Mass General Hospital. He was a patient there, and we tended to put people to work whenever they perched in our space more than a few minutes. I forget whether we had him doing anything or just let him go his way. But we did seriously pick up a lot of because of the traffic. I mean, the traffic was bad in a way in that it was impossible for anyone who needed a quiet environment to concentrate. But on the other hand, it was a supply of people, and people came through and asked what was going on, or perhaps they had read the paper and didn't realize, you know, where it was produced, and had thought about dropping by, and there they were, so they got involved. And that was important, partly because there was a lot of turnover in the early days, and skipping ahead a few weeks anyway, I remember during the time that Ellen B. Davis was our editor, and I'm not quite sure exactly from what issue to what issue that was, but I remember there being a lot of really loud arguments going on. It was discussions, but it sounded to me like arguments going on, and people would be at loggerheads and voices raised and everything, and a lot of shouting, and then there would be sort of someone would say, well, I quit, and well, I quit, and there would be like almost everybody except me, because I was just kind of staying out of it, saying I quit, and people would walk out. And I remember, at least on 2 occasions, of sitting there in the office pretty much by myself, except for, you know, the ambient traffic, thinking, oh, you know, we've got such a good start, and now we're back to zero, you know. And then 20 minutes later, everybody would come back in, chatting away, you know, and sit down and start picking, you know, they would pick up where they'd somehow, and I think a lot of it was Ellen's influence. She'd managed to, you know, let off her steam and then kind of bring people back. Maybe it was someone else. I don't really remember, but I certainly remember the feeling, the devastating feeling of thinking that, you know, this is it, you know, this is the end, and then everything's back to normal. And as I say, we did tend to pick up volunteers, especially on the nights when we had to collate and staple and get the newspaper ready to send out. That required many hands and not that many skills. So sometimes we actually went out into the coffee house, and whoever went out there to look, sometimes they would see someone they knew, or even if they didn't know, they would say, would you like to bring your cheesecake into the back and do some work for us, you know? A lot of the people who came and did that kind of grunt work then stayed with us either to do more grunt work or more creative things. And some of the people involved, I'm not sure how he came into the group, but there was a gentleman there who was quite bright and very willing to do most anything. And at the time, we needed someone to manage our classified ads, because this was maybe a couple or 3 months into the process, and we had we started opening it up for advertising, and classified ads was one of the easiest things to do. And someone else who had been doing the classified ads had left, so we needed someone to fill that position. And so this fellow Mike came in, and we put him to work as a classified ad manager. Well, Mike was someone who really couldn't comprehend numbers and relationships between numbers, and so some of our ads were blind ads, reply to box so-and-so at GCN 70 Charles Street, Boston. And the person before had very appropriately or very systematically assigned box numbers, starting with box 1 and box 2 and so on. So when Mike came, it was, I don't know, box 37 or something, and Mike didn't understand that system. And so he assigned box numbers at random, which got us in, you can imagine what's coming next. There were 2 personal ads in the newspaper, which were people who were looking for, as they say, something completely different from each other. And they both inadvertently got assigned the same box number. And we didn't catch this. I mean, the editors don't read through the classifieds, and there was no one really assigned to notice this. But and I don't remember how we found the problem. I don't know whether we found it or whether one of the advertisers found it. But anyway, and each of these ads apparently pulled a lot of responses. And we had a quick meeting and decided really the only thing that we could do to resolve that immediate issue was to actually open the responses. And so we assigned someone to open the responses and decide which ad it was for, and then tape them shut and put them in the drawer where we kept the responses to the ads. Just to say that people's talents vary. Some people are very good in one area and completely lacking in another, and it's no value judgment on them. It's just the way God designed us. And speaking of the classified, we did have a drawer there was a drawer for classified ad responses. There were drawers for various things, but you have to remember that this room couldn't be locked. So I mean, it could be locked from the outside, and in fact, Randy and us and the coffee house staff were all very good at securing the building at night from the outside. But anyone who was in the coffee house and we weren't there could easily wander in, and we would occasionally have a student who would come in and use one of our typewriters, to type a paper or something. And so there's really no control over who was there, and so we couldn't leave money in our office, and people that were working on articles had to make arrangements. And I don't really remember, because I wasn't really involved in the editorial end of things at that point. I don't really remember what arrangements people made, but I know there were some disasters where partly written articles, were just disappeared. Maybe someone needed paper to mop up a spill or something, in some comments about the people in general who were involved, and this is one of the reasons why GCN developed into a fairly radical left wing, some would say, I would say, publication. And that is because the people who were willing and able to work on it, by and large, were people who were not sort of part of the establishment. We did have a number of people, the one person in particular I remember is Doug Smith, who eventually came out publicly, but before that he worked under the name of Douglas Prince at the newspaper. And he was Harvard educated, and I think he worked at WGBH at the time, I'm not sure, but he was involved. And so there were a lot of people who were contributors who had full-time outside jobs but had to remain closeted. But the only people who could really be listed in the masthead and be the public image of the newspaper were people who were already outsiders. And I was sort of one of the in-between people, because I had my own profession. I was writing technical manuals on a freelance basis, writing computer user manuals, and I would do that about half-time, and that was sufficient to earn enough money that I could then volunteer the rest of my time, kind of split between Gay Community News and the Gay Speakers Bureau and a few other organizations. So the newspaper did kind of take on, certainly not a mainstream existence. A little bit more about I wanted to get back to the window, and there was another point that I had dropped that I was going to pick up that I don't remember what it was. But anyway, maybe it'll appear. The window, while it had its disadvantages, because like when it started getting cold, I mean, there'd be all this heat coming from the kitchen and then frigid cold coming in from the window. But it also had some advantages to us because it was also our loading dock. There would be, after a few issues of Mimeograph, Tom's arm gave out and we shifted to offset printing. And that was done by an independent printer who was on St. Mary's Street, right at, I think it's Audubon Circle, between Brookline and Boston. And I was one of the few people who had a car, so I was one of the people who would pick up the large flat sheets of paper, and of course with a newspaper you've got, it's like there's big sheets. This is on newsprint, and this came folded, but when it was done on offset on whatever kind of paper that was, it would come back and there would be 2 pages facing on the inside and 2 pages facing on the outside, and it would come back flat. And so you would have a pile of maybe 2 or maybe 3 of these, and you would have to take them back, collate them, fold them once and then fold them again. So again, that was a lot of manual labor, and there was also a logistics problem of getting the newspaper copy into the office to process. And the window helped resolve that. I remember I had a Mustang convertible at the time, and I would drive up to, and I'm sorry I can't remember the name of the fellow who ran the printing press. He was an interesting fellow himself. He was very active in the Salvation Army, which was not exactly a friend of the gay community. But he and his wife were very committed to helping us, and they gave us a really good price on printing. And for quite a while they did our printing for us. So I know the nights that I picked up the paper, I would drive by and pick up the paper there in Brookline and then drive in on Charles Street, and there'd be no parking. I mean, all the parking spots were full. So I could double park out in the street, and then we would hand in the stacks of paper through the window. you know, and then I would either go home or find a parking place or whatever. Um, and likewise, Jenny, forget her last name, when we started getting mail subscriptions for the paper, um, those would all be packed in envelopes, and for some reason those had to be hand delivered to the post office. I suspect we were probably using a nonprofit permit, which would very likely have been the meeting house's permit, and so you had to hand those in person. You couldn't just drop them in a box. And Jenny would come, but she was a night nurse at Mass General, and she did a number of things, and one of the things she did was to mail the subscriptions. And so she would come by on the night that we were folding, and she would come by and stick her head in the window, you know, hi there, and we would take her backpack and fill it up with newspapers and hand it back to her. That's if she was running late. Other times she would come in and sit and, you know, chat and do work with us and everything. So the window was useful in a number of ways. There were also people who, there were a number of people who were either allies or more likely very closeted gay and lesbian people who would make donations from their office supply cabinets, and a lot of those would come in, you know, through the window. That window's still there. There's an antique shop or something inside. I don't know. There were some other colorful people there. Ron Arruda was someone who I hope you get a chance to talk with him sometime when he's in Boston. I think I met him through Gay Community News, and we've been friends since. And Ron did a lot of work with layout. He was primarily, he was the primary source for the little filler graphics. I can show you in the guide anyway, the little drawings and stuff, you know, that he would find in old dictionaries and other stuff from the late 19th century, early 20th. And he had a collection of those, and he always had something that was appropriate for whatever we needed the filler or illustration for. I remember him, one of the most vivid memories I have of him anyway, aside from the enormous amount of work that he did at the paper, was during the first winter when it was like very warm in our office, despite the chilly wind coming in. And everybody would come in bundled up in, you know, ski parkas and everything. Well, Ron came in with a light jacket, flannel shirt, and overalls, and then and underneath of which he had long underwear, you know, tops and bottoms. So he would come in, and the first thing he would do is take off his jacket, then he would take off his shirt and coveralls, and then he would take off his long underwear, you know, standing there bare ass naked, you know, and then he would put on the outer layer, the overalls and shirt again, you know. And it was like, it was just so nonchalant, like, you know, other people taking their coat off. Anyway, it was not what I was used to in the other offices where I worked. And in fact, I believe, sort of symbolic of that, I think that one of the annual photos of the GCN staff, Ronnie is sitting there, obviously with nothing on, you know, strategically behind someone else. I don't know what year that was. It could have been the first year. There's a you may have, do you have a copy of that first staff picture on the stairways, on the stairway? Yeah, that was a classic because I know Doug Smith, AKA Doug Prince, was there, and he had the proverbial lampshade over his head. Which was very symbolic of how our community had to live at the time. Speaking of time, I don't know what time it is and how long we want to go on this.
Let's stop for a minute.
Okay.
Can you